Okay, good day, everyone. Welcome to Yoda World's Pop TV session for today. My name is Alicia, and I will be your facilitator. And we'll be covering today's topic on qualitative informal education. The focus for today is in contrast to last week's talk about formalized global education. And this discussion, we're going to be challenging what it means to experience substantive, informal education, some of the pros and cons to it, and its impact on a culture of peace. We're broadcasting from our YouTube page today for the remainder of the program as well. For the sessions this year, we have a few sessions left. So you're welcome to provide your comments and questions at any time in the comment section. And you're, of course, also welcome to visit the POP portal at eotopop.net. That's eotopop.net to view notes from some of our sessions that you may have missed. You can also register for our customized social network that we are almost ready to fully reveal that will help you continue the learning process outside of these sessions. So to set this up, let's first talk about informal education versus non-formal education. There is a distinct difference between the two, and it's important to understand it. So for the point of reference that we can explore for our topic, informal education is knowledge learned outside of a formal education system. So there can be some sense of structure, but it's not regimented learning that leads to a type of accreditation like a degree, a license, or a professional certificate. With formal education, people learn through experiences and exposure to different environments, people and concepts that can come through sources like daily conversations and physical interactions. But there are some other distinctions to make about informal education that is important to compare with the other category of education that I mentioned earlier, which is non-formal. So we're going to take and borrow from the UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, a mouthful. They have a definition for non-formal education, and it's defined as education that is institutionalized, intentional, and planned by an education provider. The defining characteristic of non-formal education is that it is an addition, alternative, and/or a complement to formal education within the process of the lifelong learning of individuals. It is often provided to guarantee the right of access to education for all. Big, because we've been talking a lot about education for all with Agenda 2030, otherwise known as Sustainable Development Goals, and specific the Goal 4, which is education for all. It caters for people of all ages, but does not necessarily apply a continuous pathway or structure. It may be short in duration and/or low intensity, and it's typically provided in the form of short courses, workshops, or seminars. Non-formal education mostly leads to qualifications that are not recognized as formal qualifications by the relevant national educational authorities, or to no qualifications at all. Then it goes on to say that non-formal education can cover programs contributing to adult and youth literacy and education for out-of-school children, as well as programs on life skills, work skills, and social or cultural development. Keeping with UNESCO's definitions that they have on different types of learning, informal learning then has a more comprehensively guided definition through them, which we can analyze just a bit further. So, informal education is noted as forms of learning that are intentional or deliberate, but are not institutionalized. They are less organized and structured than either formal or non-formal education. We talked about formal education last session. And informal learning may include learning activities that occur in the family, in the workplace, in the local community, in daily life, on a self-directed, family-directed, or socially directed basis. There are some other definitions that provide insight about the parameters of informal learning, and I want to give you two other definitions because there are many ways that informal learning is described, but we'll also put it all together and figuring out what can we pull from each of these definitions that will help us in our working knowledge, and then we can know how to apply that. The other definitions that provide insight about the parameters of informal learning one of them comes from the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training. And they say that informal learning is learning resulting from daily activities related to work, family, or leisure. It is not organized or structured, and they put in parentheses in terms of objectives or time or learning support. Informal learning in most cases is unintentional from the learner's perspective, and it typically does not lead to certification. So that's directly from the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training, and that is actually referenced in their 2008 Terminology of European Education and Training Policy. Another definition that we can take away, just using different international perspectives, comes from the South African Qualifications Authority, known as SAQA for short. They provide a really easy definition to remember, and they simply say that informal learning is learning that results from daily activities related to paid or unpaid work, family or community life, or leisure. And that's a 2013 definition that SAQA has put forward. Though there are many ways that informal education is described, there are some common threads that we can use to anchor our discussion today. And there are 5 main points. The first one is that informal education is a lifelong learning process. The second would be that everyone receives informal education. So it is inherently an inclusive process by that measure. The third is that informal education can be intentional or unintentional. So UNESCO referenced that it is intentional, but there was also the reference from the European Center that we referenced, mentioned that it can often be unintentional for the learner. So that's really interesting. And then the fourth thing that we can glean from these definitions is that informal education does not have to lead to formal or non-formal education. So that is, it doesn't have to lead to some level of professionalism, whether it be a degree or a certificate or licensure. And then the big takeaway about informal education is that informal education is valuable. This all means that each of us are partners in giving and receiving informal education. That's just the bulk of it. We all have something to share. We all have something to learn from each other throughout our entire lives. This type of perspective can then help us better shape an understanding about how individual actions when taken informally shapes communities. It's out of our experiences that we can begin to challenge what the systems around us are and even lead us into other forms of education to strengthen and use expertise that would be recognized within formal structures. So informal education can complement, enhance, and shift concepts addressed in and with formal education. For example, a type of informal education can be media. So traditional media informs the public, But also there's citizen-led media, such as citizen journalism. And there are also social media influencers, people that have developed a large following or fan base. And these examples in informal education have become whole courses of study in institutions, and there are degrees that you can explore social impact and digital social strategies or digital marketing strategies to increase your influence in social media spheres and beyond. So by that example, we can see that formal education, educational institutions, they can take notice of things like social phenomenons, and then they can seek to quantify it or even define it. And sometimes those phenomenons become professionalized, much like the expanded concept of using social media. There are now ways where you can become certified in the effective use of social media, and it's recognized by industry professionals. People get paid according to their level of knowledge and knowing things like SEO, engine optimization, community build, online community building, things of that nature. So I want to talk a little bit about what the aim of informal education should be. Um, it should be substantive, and especially in the case of peace building, it really has to come from individual intention. So we began exploring Agenda 2030, aka the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs for short, as it relates to goal 4, which is educational for all, but not just education for all, but quality education for all. Last week, one of the things that I pointed out was that education for all is meant to be transformative, lifelong learning. And earlier in this session, I referenced several points agreed internationally about informal education. So we went over that it's a lifelong process. And one of the things that I think a lot about, I try to live and encourage others to do so, is to be intentional about how you move about the planet. I love saying that. Be intentional about how you move about the planet. It's so important. It's not a foreign concept. It's something that we hear in different ways quite often in our societies. So there's sayings like, take responsibility for your actions or your energy, or think before you act. And these are ways in which each of us are held to the expectation in our societies of how we are supposed to ideally carry ourselves. We don't get to act intentionally by accident. So when we are exposed to different qualities of informal education, we learn which are the ways are socially acceptable behavior. And taking a bit from UNESCO and speaking about the Declaration of a Culture of Peace, which is their resolution that formalized the roadmap toward a culture of peace. Not the discussion, because the discussion had been there long before then, but one of the things that they explicitly state is that peace has to start in the hearts and minds of men, because war also starts in the hearts and minds of men. So if we expand that thinking about education within that context, then it means that each of us has to actively choose to informally educate about aspects of peace. The question then is, how can informal education become qualitative, meaning measured by quality instead of quantity? So I want to back up a little bit and just make sure that I say that quantity is not bad. Having a variety, a large variety of education for peace is not a bad thing. It serves us well. The more that we can see increased examples of peace building. The catch is that it should be aligned with with internationally agreed principles. That's why we have the UN to begin with, to get us all on one accord, to have a roadmap for the future of the world that we live in many different areas. So it becomes important for those of us that are aware of these international principles to share this information with others informally. I think that it's important to really stop and accentuate that while it is completely okay and your decision to gain professional recognition to assist in areas like international development, your responsibility as a world citizen is to also carry out what you learn within informal spaces. Otherwise, what's really the point? On the one hand, you would be assisting in your professional life, presumably, right? The things that you're learning to so-called improve conditions that are often socially and politically intertwined. And then on the other, you would be contributing to the attitudes and values that create these pockets of conflict. So it's a counterintuitive way of engaging in the world. And everyone that becomes well versed in principles of peace building or the SDGs should really actively be seeking to live the values that some people are getting paid to work through as well. Um, but our lives should be lived in such a way that it's a bonus to get paid to do such work and not the purpose. It's not your purpose to be on the planet just to get paid to do something that hopefully is enriching the world. It's a bonus, but it's your duty as a world citizen to make sure that we can have a future for other generations that come behind us. It's the basics of self-preservation. Secondly, informal education, it can become qualitative when it is a mutually beneficial learning process. That is to say that just because some of us may formally or even non-formally learn about peace or sustainable development, it doesn't mean we have all the answers. There has to be some humility in the way that you approach your life. We have a lot to learn from people that do not speak the same type of language that reinforces a culture of peace. They may not talk about it in the way that you're talking about it in your particular profession, but it also is part of the beautiful challenge of making a culture of peace stick. It's figuring out how practical insights can be made to transform those individual moments in a positive direction, because the small positive results then become motivation for larger results or greater results. And that's what real empowerment is, right? Um, so we have to be supportive of people and try not to block their journey by placing hierarchies on knowledge um, when it's just a lifelong learning process for everybody. I wonder what you think about that. If I can stop there just for a moment to get you to think about it. One of our definitions that was mentioned was that lifelong learning can be unintentional for the learner. So can you think about things that you've come to just quote unquote know that you didn't intentionally seek to learn? I can think of some things usually when I'm thinking about childhood. There are things that now as an adult I do and say, oh, wow, I actually learned that from my parents. And they didn't necessarily explicitly say to me, um, you know, to be responsible is to pay bills on time, right? Just using a very simple, easily understood example. They didn't say that, but they modeled that, right? And so that was something that I learned. I didn't seek to learn that as a child. It just was something that was around me. And so it's something that I carry on in adulthood. So can you identify something along those lines? It could be very simple, it could be much more complex, but the idea is to really think about it. And when you think about it, what you've learned, um, did it help you move in a more positive direction? Was it a more negative direction? Or did it really just maintain your outlook the way that it is now? or back then. Important that we start to really examine ourselves. A cultural piece really takes a lot of personal insight, and sometimes it can be really challenging to do that. It's not always fun to piece apart aspects of yourself, of your life, of how you're perceived by others, of what you want to do, but it's part of being a human being. It just is. All right, so I want to go through just a little bit of pros and cons. I'm going to look at some types of community experiences with informal education. There are pros and cons to anything, and I would totally be remiss if this discussion didn't speak to some of the takeaways about promoting and carrying out informal education. Some of the pros is that informal education is more cost effective, certainly, than other forms of education. There are people that have to pay, certainly, for formal education, um, but also people can pay for non-formal education when they're getting a professional certificate or some sort of training that results in certification for a group or for an individual. The other pro is that it doesn't demand a specific structure. So you can really move the way that feels most organic. And people learn through this fluidity. And perhaps it's even more organic in ways to learn informally. Um, and it's also a pro that informal education is personable. So it can really be something that you take on, that you really embody. But there are some challenges to informal education. And one of them is that it entirely depends on someone's environment. The more isolated someone is, the less likely he or she is able to find diverse perspectives. And that really presents a big challenge because, in general, as human beings, though we are curious in ways, you have to really cultivate curiosity. Um, if things are seeming to work for you, there's a saying in English that says, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. And, people can take that to the extreme if they feel like the way that they live their life, although others might view it as um, inherently a problem for some areas, especially if it affects them. If the person that is having that life doesn't really see a need to move outside of it, that can create a lot of opposition and impede progress. If it is something that is multiplied by many people, which it becomes groups, and groups are formed in different ways, different communities and different sectors of society, that can then become a movement of sorts, which is why we have these different factions, or one of the reasons why we have these different factions of people who have difference of opinion in the way that human rights is supposed to be observed, and what it means to have peace, right? We talk a lot about how peace is not just the absence of physical violence, it's not just the absence of war. So those are sort of the reactionary things, and the passive things, but you have to actively work toward peace so that you can prevent getting to a level of conflict that is so extreme that it really impacts people, massive amounts of people, negatively, such as war. And let's see, another disadvantage of informal education is that in circumstances of oppression, informal education toward a culture of peace can really go by the wayside. The culture of peace in this instance, in terms of oppression, it means that the culture of peace in that society is already weakened to a degree, because one of the tenets of a culture of peace is equality and social equity for all. You can't have that when you have significant forms of oppression. And in this way, I'm actually talking about systemic oppression, things that are codified. It's legal to discriminate against certain groups of people, to deny people access to basic human rights like clean water and a decent place to live and living wages, a clean environment, the ability to subsist um, without the threat of physical harm or state violence, and to be able to move in between borders. I mean, we can go on and on a little bit, but I just wanted to give you a little bit more in-depth understanding, but also very importantly, sustainable development, this idea that the resources that we use on the planet, no matter who might be more in charge of it seemingly than others, meaning governments and private companies and other sorts of stakeholders that will develop pieces of land, and other types of resources to continue moving forward the world economy, that is done in a way that's responsible, that is that does not impede people from having a decent quality of life, and that doesn't cut off the resources, or present negative consequences that are irreversible for future generations. So this is why informal education for a culture of peace and sustainable development goals, they have to be intentional. The knowledge has to be willingly passed on from person to person in their everyday routine settings. So it really has to be hit home. I cannot stress this enough. Though it is intentional on your part, you also have to be open to receiving. And that, I think, is where the unintentional part comes in on the part of the learner. So the learner is really, it is intentionally being open to some degree to intentionally, unintentionally, receive things that they didn't even think of. And that sounds a little weird probably, but the closest I can get to it is a saying that I know of that um, that I've heard quite often, which is be comfortable with the uncomfortable. So it's sort of like the same concept, right? In order to push through the experience of vulnerability, of being uncomfortable, you have to make up your mind, um, to experience it and take some comfort in that it's going to be okay in the end. So much in the same way, if we can open ourselves to knowing that there's lots of things that we don't know, there's lots of things that we think we know that we could learn more about, and just being open to knowing that a lifelong process of learning is what everyone goes through, and taking comfort in knowing that we're all just trying to figure out how to get it right, so that we can have a good legacy. And that's what it means to intentionally move about the planet, making sure that you have those types of experiences, that you can look back on, that you can share and move with other people. With that, I want to give you some concrete ideas about how to intentionally perform informal education in your life. So we've talked a lot about the parameters of informal education and what it can be, but it's really important that people get a practical sense. And so I'm going to give you two examples, but I'm going to extensively go through them. And I would love to hear some examples that you might come up with, because this is really the part where I will challenge you more to critically think about the ways in which you connect to a culture of peace, because it's one thing to say that everyone connects to it and connects to these sustainable development goals. It's another to get people to think about how they connect to it through giving them some examples. The first example I have is one that is like really, really um, basic. And it's basic because the group of people that I'm directing this to are parents. Children are like sponges, right? So they soak up everything around them. And it also means, in the parameters of this discussion, that they're learning informally. Even before children exit the womb, they're learning, they're exploring. So just as you would be intentional about teaching, for example, your child to have manners, or trying to coach your child how to say mama or dada. That can be a big debate for parents, which one the child says first and why, but in a fun way. Or even if you're coaching your child how to walk, right? You should also intentionally be building him or her up with life skills toward a culture of peace. So it involves not just telling children to be kind or to be nice. I've certainly heard that a lot, and I think that it's just something that you just say, sort of like saying, hello, how are you, but not really wanting people to dive deep into how they're actually doing. But telling children to be nice is sort of one of those things where you definitely want them to be nice, but are you really thinking about how deeply that means, right? Because if you want children to be nice, it's about demonstrating what that means. It's not just about paying lip service. It's prioritizing dialogue. Um, it's having a good handle on feelings and listening to others. It's reflecting on what others say and what you want to say, to reduce conflict. But even before getting to conflict, reducing misunderstanding, or flipping it on its positive side, seeking to understand, right? It's showing solidarity and empowering, as well as celebrating others. And it's taking care of the environment. It's things like helping children to know not to litter, to feed your children nutritious foods, to um, engaging them with entertainment and books that are based upon values, that reinforce values that they're seeing around them, that you're introducing in your home and in the way you interact with other people outside of your home. Um, so to that end, the most important thing is that the adults are modeling the progress um, that they're looking to see in children, or that they're telling children that they want to see, which is really, really important. So taking um, a political example a bit from the United States, at this point in time, we're talking again, unfortunately, about gun control and what it means to have gun control. And so there are lots of conversations happening, mostly, unfortunately, shouting from each sides of a debate. We've devolved a little bit in this country for just sort of screaming matches and witty talking points that are based out of mean-spirited commentary, and that's unfortunate. But to that end, children are watching that, right? And so when you have these situations where you have children, which, by the way, international definition goes to 15 to 16. So we're including teenagers, early teens, in this concept of talking about children. When you have a situation where you have children who are unfortunately going to school and committing mass acts of violence, in this case, talking about gun control with automatic assault weapons, and this country being number one in having this type of problem, it's indicative of adults modeling behaviors that children are then reflecting back to them. And that's just the short of it. Much in the same way that you will find it reflected in whatever your society is, and why we have to take a really close look and continue to challenge ourselves and be accountable on a world stage about the types of values that we're imparting to children. It's how government officials are choosing to rule, so on and so forth. And it's also, in terms of parents in this context, important for parents to have these discussions. It's hard, I'm sure, and not every level of discussion is appropriate for a particular age of your child. You have to figure out how to have these discussions. The reality is that regardless of the age, the child is affected, right? So you have to find ways to be comfortable with the balance between letting a child be a child, being essentially carefree and having a way to explore concepts without, but also having some realistic sense of the world that is increasingly moving toward people taking more adult roles, unfortunately, for a number of reasons, not just because of violence, but also, but as a consequence, often, to violence, to whether it be conflict with war, whether it be violence inflicted by the state against different groups with discrimination, or whether it be the violence in the general sense of climate change and the types of impact that we are seeing and will continue to see, where children are the most vulnerable. Certainly, in the sessions that were done earlier with Julieta, earlier in the program year, talking about the vulnerability of children in poverty, having multi-dimensional levels of poverty. Those things are symptomatic of the values that adults say that they are about, but are falling short in performing. So again, the keyword is progress. These suggestions aren't meant to hold you to perfect standards. It's that you need to be open, to be vulnerable. You need to keep striving and giving and receiving support for your children. And children gain the most from that. And that's where they are able to see that the values are not just talking points. So the other example, really basic example, totally lumping in a huge group of people intentionally. So I used parents and their impact on children, but it's also adults that don't have children. So adults meaning everybody under the sun, including the adults that are parents, but also in the sense of parents being different, because parents can also include sometimes children. Sometimes children become parents. So as adults, just like children are sponges, so are we. The only distinction between adults and children, really biologically, is that, and I'm using this as a blanket statement, right? Just really generalizing things to make it very simple. We have the ability as adults to make sound decisions using advanced reasoning and weighing information. And that's because our prefrontal cortex, it's an area of the brain that deals with reason. With all things being equal, provided there aren't any delays or trauma to the brain, in that sense, the adult prefrontal cortex is, being an adult, your prefrontal cortex is fully formed. So that means that it's a tremendous responsibility to be an adult. Clearly, we understand that as adults, right? But in the context of a culture of peace, it really means that we should always be practicing a culture of peace to produce progress. Um, it's not something that is passive, and this is the purpose of being an activist, right? For those of you out there that might be watching that are already activists, the idea is that you are active. You cannot be an activist and just be sitting around sort of benefiting and not contributing. But the tremendous responsibility for a cultural peace, in producing that progress, it means that we're modeling for each other, in addition to modeling for children. So it shouldn't just be for show whenever kids are around. Uh, I don't know about you, but I've seen instances where adults sort of change their language or change their behavior when children are around. And look, guilty, been there, where you're having a conversation that you don't really want to introduce to a child at that point, or it's not your role to do so. So you curb what you say. But what I'm talking about is deeper than that, um, where where the intentionality of behaving in front of children um, is to manipulate the ideas of children, and that's really dangerous because then it's also meant on the flip side of that to manipulate the ideas of adults about you. Um, and so it's really important that when we talk about modeling behaviors for each other as adults, that it really means holding each other accountable out of love. I have to say that, out of love. And when I say that, I don't mean some esoteric way of understanding people. Like, yes, you can have tense conversations, but these tense conversations have to come from a place of really respecting the person for who they are, that they're a human being first and foremost, even if you don't particularly like their personality or you just don't click with them for some reason. That's totally okay, but it's not okay, for example, if you're referring to someone in derogatory terms. Like, that's not cool. Nobody enjoys being called out of their name, so to speak. So that's part of modeling behavior, right? And it doesn't just matter if you're in a position of authority or a professional position, given that we're talking about informal learning and how we all have access to it, whether we realize it or not, we're always learning from each other. So it becomes a personal responsibility to make sure that you're modeling behavior. I really don't want to use this overused cliche because I think people really forget what that can mean. But I guess in this context, I can say it a little bit, which is be the change you want to see in the world. I can't think of anything else at the moment, but if you come up with one, please let me know. So what you have to do in order to be intentional about this is expand your insights by searching out information that challenge your value system. And this is really difficult. I mentioned earlier that we don't inherently seek out things that oppose us, but it's why adults are in different professional positions, excuse me, have a duty to expand what they know outside of their 9 to 5 in informal ways. So I'll leave you with a really quick example of that, of how it can spiral and really touch other people and communities just from one person in one position. So for example, suppose by day you're a journalist and your beat, as they call it, your area of focus is on crime and politics. So in a culture piece context, progress can look like you making sure that you maintain respectful dialogue within your team. And I'm focusing on team here because sometimes it's not possible with the way that you have to report to to touch upon all the areas of a culture of peace. Certainly, you want to try to influence your audience. And if you're a real journalist, so going by the standard journalism values, um, that already covers the way that you are supposed to talk about things, not with a colored bias. So just to put that out there. Now, if you're a citizen journalist that's not necessarily formally trained and you don't necessarily know things like the AP style, then you need to think about how you can learn more about that and position your language in a way that is more neutral and can provide insight from more than one angle, being fair in the positioning of your information. But that said, so focusing on respectful dialogue within your team. So this is behind the scenes stuff that I'm talking about. It means giving everyone room to explore debates and not dominating conversations and opportunities all the time. So that's knowing how to really share resources. That's important, right? It's being able to serve as well as lead, and it might even lead into something that is helping the office develop like a waste reduction plan. And you wouldn't necessarily know how to do that yourself as a journalist, but why not work with the janitorial crew, since they would have working knowledge of how the building operates in terms of waste management, etc. They could also bring in other people. And just by that one person, in this example, our journalist, the possibilities start to expand into other areas of expertise that become involved. So it becomes a snowball effect where one person is thinking and acting in a way that they want to improve an environment, and they're bringing in other people, and the collaboration and organic ways of learning, informal learning from one another, starts to take a life of its own, and you can really have small up through very significant advances. But the thing here is that all of it is of value, so it's worth it to keep trying. So based on the examples that I've given, I'd like to challenge you to identify a role that you have where you can practice a cultural piece, some of the principles that have been discussed in your informal settings. And I recommend just choosing one thing and see how it goes from there. If you're more advanced, certainly you want to challenge yourself to add more and more things. And it's not meant for you to be perfect at it. No one's perfect. And you may not feel like you're the greatest person at it, but that's not even the point. The point is that it's valuable to try and to keep trying. I want to thank you very much for your time today, and we'll see you next week, Thursday, same time, 1500 UTC. If you're on the East Coast like me in New York City, that's 10 a.m. Eastern, and we'll be having the rest of the sessions through YouTube Live. And the next session, we'll be talking about the role of teachers in providing quality education and what that looks like in terms of empowering a culture of peace. So thanks again. You're welcome to reach us at any time, and we'll see you soon. Bye.